Hello, just making sure the audio is clear there. I want to talk in this video about the subject of grammar, specifically within the English language. Um, this is something that I've contemplated a little bit, looking at numerous conversations and just discourse in general. Um, I guess first of all, it's appropriate for me to give a little bit of my own background because it does relate to this. Um, I've been an English teacher. I have worked at a high school in China. I have been an English tutor. I've taught free on a freelance basis one-to-one, and I've also done a lot of proofreading work. So I've quite a lot of experience in working with the English language. Um, but I want to address the subject of grammar Nazis. Okay, you may or may not have heard this term. Basically, it's pejorative describing people who are excessively pedantic about the rules of grammar, or the rules of grammar as they perceive it to be, that is. Um, in other words, people who are so obsessed by correct grammar that they somehow see it as a duty upon themselves to go out of their way on cyberspace or in oral communication to correct other people. Um, Obviously, Nazi is an exaggeration, but it's kind of a pejorative indicating that these people are incredibly um, arrogant and controlling. And I've given some thought to this. If you're from a teaching background, I think there's an expectation that you will automatically defend or agree with grammar Nazis because the assumption is that if you're from a similar background, you're going to also be very pedantic about these sort of issues. But I have actually come to certain, let's say, belief on this, which I've spent some time contemplating. Um, because communication is obviously an extremely important thing. I'm talking here within the boundaries of the English language. Obviously, there will be grammar rules in every language. So I'm just speaking about English in this context, just to simplify matters for the sake of this video. Although probably something similar could be said in most languages, certainly most major languages. Um, I I take a fundamental view that the most important aspect of communication is the understanding of context. I believe that context is everything. I believe that trumps all grammar rules, because it is the most basic fundamental thing we look at when we are in discourse with someone, and that could be any sort of communication. It could be a discussion, it could be an argument, it could be um, just chit chat. It could be any sort of discourse with someone. The key thing is context. So if you're in a discussion, for example, if you're working together on a project, the discussion is going to be on the subject of whatever the subject material is. If you're in an argument, it's going to be about point scoring, like you know how an argument goes. It could be, I mean, there's even different forms of arguments. It could be a personal argument, or it could be a debate about a given subject. But anyway, there's all these different sorts of discourses between human beings, and I would argue that in all of them, the main issue is context, understanding what the fundamental subject is about. Now, in the case of arguments, very often that's why arguments get heated, because there's a different understanding from both parties of what, not only maybe the perspective on the subject, but sometimes even what the subject is. That's why arguments naturally get heated. Um, but I have to admit that I do find those who are excessively pedantic about grammar to be incredibly annoying. Um, and I'm not sure if they realize just how obnoxious they come across. Now, I've seen two points of view with this. I've seen those who are critical and who say that they are. Excuse me, the phone. No, that's a spam call. So, um, yes. So, lost my trail of thought now. Yes, there's two perspectives on this. Basically, there are those who probably, I would say, the majority of people who just find pedantic grammar Nazis to be incredibly tiresome and arrogant and so forth and so on. The other camp is those themselves, and I've seen the argument on. There's a number of videos about this. In fact, I came across a video a while back. It's kind of like it's sort of satire. It's quite funny, and it shows an actual guy dressed in a Nazi suit in a 1930s setting, and instead of being anti-Semitic and this sort of thing, he's focusing on the local farmers' lack of spelling. It's quite a funny video if you check it out. Anyway, I left my views on the subject there, and one particular comment I typed attracted quite a lot of feedback. I got a lot of thumbs up, over 100 thumbs up. A lot of people could see where I was coming from because it said that I come from a teaching background, but I actually dislike grammar Nazis. But then a few people who, let's say, didn't agree with what I was saying took it upon themselves to point out my grammatical mistakes, although in that particular sentence I couldn't really see what they were getting at. But anyway, they didn't like what I was saying, and they couldn't see that A, the video was light-hearted, it wasn't meant to be taken seriously, but B, okay, it wasn't meant to be taken seriously, but there is a genuine grievance behind it, in that people generally do not like feeling that they're being spoken to in a condescending way. And what those who are pedantic about grammar need to understand is simply the vast majority of people don't care. This is just the truth. The vast majority of people do not care. The most common denominator in communication is understanding of context. The fact of the matter is, when people communicate on a daily basis, um, they're not thinking about grammar. They're thinking about whether or not the other person can understand. If you go to a shop and buy something, if you're even in more formal situations, um, perfect grammar is not always the most notable thing about that discourse. The most notable aspect is that both parties can understand one another. Now, of course, grammar developed as a way to structure language. Um, some publications suggest that the first usage of modern grammar in a textbook was back in 1795. An interesting thing is that it would be very easy to sort of defend this if it was only people who weren't from an academic teaching background who were critical. But actually, there's some people from the academic field themselves who are, I mean, from the academic field of linguistics, who themselves are quite critical of the way this is developing. I'm just reading an article here on the Daily Telegraph about Professor Jeffrey Pullen, who basically feels that the purists are destroying the English language. It's quite a long article, so I won't read it out word for word, but I'll put a link to that. You know, the thing about having good grammar is, yes, it does improve a sentence in terms of structure and so on. Um, I also recognize that some people have terrible grammar, and as a teacher, of course, I notice that, and of course, it's something that is very detrimental to communication, especially written communication. Um, so I don't think there's a problem with pointing out something when it is that bad. I mean, when the sentence structure is almost like text speak, I totally understand the contention with that. But what I take issue with is those who are so pedantic that they nitpick every single little detail. Um, and they believe that daily oral communication has to be based on complex grammar rules. That's something I've little time for. Um, when I taught English, I focus primarily on oral English. In fact, that's what I was instructed to do. So I guess I appreciate the power of oral communication. Um, and I really firmly believe that the most important thing is the understanding of context, not having perfect grammar. And I appreciate that's a very controversial position to take within academic circles, and no doubt there will be certain other teachers and people in academic circles who will call me a charlatan and say I don't really care about the language and this sort of thing. That couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, it's precisely because I care that I recognise that that sort of pedantic, pushy nitpicking is just the vast majority of people do not appreciate, and I don't actually believe it helps them anyway. Because it's not like I don't know if grammar Nazis, and I apologise that I keep using the term, but basically I don't know if they realise that people are not going to thank them for that condescending attitude. And maybe they don't think it is condescending. Maybe they just see it as. I mean, I saw one guy under that video say, "Oh, grammar Nazis is just a term used by anyone who didn't pass English class." That sort of stuck-up, priggish attitude is not going to do you any favors. I mean, and there's another point of contention I think is very important to raise. Having perfect grammar is not the only tenet to being an intelligent person. There are many very skilled, successful, and intelligent people who were not that proficient in having great grammar. As far as I understand, Steve Jobs is an example. Um, there's a lot of people, and that's another issue. There's people who suffer from certain learning difficulties or certain um, issues that would impact them that wouldn't necessarily impact other people, maybe dyslexia or other issues that mean that their communication is not the sort of ideal standard that certain people would hold it to. But it doesn't mean that they are going to fail in life. And I think that I understand that certain situations where it is appropriate. Okay, if you're an examiner and you're marking an assignment or a dissertation, and a student has particularly bad grammar, then naturally you're going to point that out. Of course, that's completely legitimate. But I think what irritates people is even when they're communicating on a day-to-day basis, and then certain people take it upon themselves to be so pedantic. I mean, for one thing, quite often when people communicate, they may be tired, um, and unless you're really a Nobel laureate in grammar, then you're not going to spend a great deal of time focusing on each and every important aspect of that. Or I shouldn't say important aspect, actually, each and every trivial aspect. I mean, clearly there's certain rules in grammar that are common sense and are, kind of is something that we learn from a very young age. But there are more complex grammar rules when things start getting into the realm of really getting into comprehensive grammar, then I think it just puts people off. And I really believe that when it comes to communication, you are not making yourself an intelligent person just by being that pedantic. Real intelligence comes from gaining knowledge about the world in which we live, about how the human world works. You can have perfect grammar, but you may have a very poor understanding of a particularly given subject. So, what's the point of having perfect grammar if you don't actually have a clue about the subject in which you want to use that grammar? So, my point with that is that it's is not the only tenet to intelligence, and I do see a certain smugness from some of these people that will create a lot of resentment. Um, I honestly don't know how this video is going to go down. It may well be that there are other people, and the problem is when I done this before, it got quite personal. People were saying, "Oh, prove you're a teacher," and it got into personal attacks against myself. And again, I said to those people, "Look, you're not doing yourself any favors. I know what my background is. I know I've helped people. Um, because if I didn't, I would have lost my job. You know, so I am just making the point that with communication, and there is another aspect to this actually. I'll finish that sentence with communication. The most important aspect is context. But there is another aspect to this, and it's something that needs to be also considered. Language itself, especially the English language, naturally alters over time. You know, we are now introducing a lot of new words into the English language of this digital age, especially, that 10 years ago would have been shunned at. You know, we're seeing a lot of text speak that is increasingly being accepted as general communication. Now, a lot of academics frown at that, and I'm not. You know, I wouldn't be a huge fan of, you know, lazy linguistics replacing traditional standard words. Of course, I would think that would be not a welcome development, but my point is that language does develop, it does alternate over time. And the most important thing is that the majority of people understand the context. Now, there are situations whereby people have become accustomed to using the local dialects, for example. And especially in the UK, very often local dialects are quite in contrast with standard English, i.e., the sort of English that international students would learn. Um, and I often say, in many cases, the grammar of international students is a lot higher than some British people. That doesn't necessarily mean the British people are stupid. It just means that they have become adapted to the dialect in which they're using. Now, I tend to be quite, I try to be open-minded on this in the sense that I don't sort of look down on dialects. I do think, though, it is important to recognise that if you're someone who's lived in a certain region your whole life and you use the local dialect, um, it's okay to cherish that, but you can't say that it is a standard language because it isn't. Um, so what I would say is it's okay on a daily, in terms of daily usage, but not for academic purposes. Um, and I think that's another thing. You know, it's all very well people who are so pedantic with grammar focusing on it in the context where it's part and parcel of trying to, for example, achieve a higher grade or trying to pass an exam or something like that. But what I think really irritates people is when they try to bring it into the sphere of everyday communication. Now, without wanting to sound too vain, I've known many people in my life, and I've heard a lot of people say that they regard me as quite an intelligent person, um, above average, I've been told. I believe I do have quite a good knowledge on a wide range of issues. I would never be so arrogant as to make myself out to be, you know, all knowing. I think we're always learning new things, but both because I come from a teaching background and also because this is a theory that I'm quite sympathetic to. That is the theory that context is a lot more important than very strict grammar. Then that's why I feel the need to make this video and to really raise some of the issues because you know what I'm talking about is a comfortable, common sense, balanced approach. Of course, you do not want a situation where grammar is completely chucked out the window. And I am certainly not saying anything goes. Of course, you need rules in language. Of course, you need set structure. Um, but you know, the most important thing is effective communication. Now, sometimes I'm trying to describe something. I'm an intelligent person. Sometimes I'm trying to describe something, and the words just don't come to me. You know, they just sometimes I don't have a speech impediment, but sometimes I slur my words just a little bit because I'm trying to find the right word, or maybe I've described something not quite in the way I would like to, and then I reflect on that. You might notice that in some of my videos. I don't have a speech impediment, but it is something that I've noticed myself. So I believe that I'm a pretty good communicator. I have a wide circle of friends from a wide range of backgrounds. I know many people. I've received very positive feedback from my discourse online. I've received negative feedback as well. But the point with that is that I believe I have an ability to communicate with a very wide range of people. I believe I'm a pretty diplomatic person. Doesn't mean I can't have strong views on things, but I know in myself that I've had an ability to be very versatile in terms of communicating with people. That is a lot more important than being so pedantic about grammar rules. I'll leave it there. Sorry, this is quite a lengthy video, but I do believe the issues are quite important. Um, I'd like to know what people think. Preferably, I'd like to hear from people who are not from teaching backgrounds, because I can already predict that they're just going to say, I'm phony, I'm not a real teacher. And by the way, that's another thing. One thing I never do is try to condescend other teachers. I think that's it's a little bit like musicians slagging each other off. I mean, why run down other people? I don't think that's really, all I'm doing is arguing that whilst grammar is very important, of course it is equally important, if not more important, that the context is understood. And that does not mean having ideal, perfect grammar. It really doesn't. Um, so basically, that's what I'm saying. We need to consider communication most of the time actually is informal. Even in situations where you're speaking to strangers, if you're ordering train tickets or getting something in the shop, even in those situations where you're communicating with strangers, then it's still largely informal because you're asking some very basic things. I mean, clearly, if you go in and speak, like, if you're going to a train station and say, "Oh, give me a ticket for Liverpool," that would be considered rude. It would be considered a crude way of speaking. So I'm not saying that grammar isn't important. I'm not saying that for 1 second. I'm just saying that people who obsessively focus on it need to understand just how obnoxious that can come across. Because actually, it isn't just about in their mind, fixing the grammar, but what they need to understand is an incredibly controlling way to communicate with other people. If they want to be pedantic themselves, fair enough, but they need to understand that they're not going to be thanked for behaving that way with others. And I'm not saying that anything goes. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that I think we need to really reflect on what generic communication comes down to. And it doesn't come down to professors debating about the finer points of grammar. It just doesn't. Thanks for listening.